Good morning, everybody. That was a horribly disappointing response. I have to say, good morning, everybody. How are you? Hey, it's a beautiful rainy day outside. Boris Johnson is Prime Minister of the UK. What can go wrong? I mean, really, we should all be extremely optimistic. And it's the perfect moment. I don't think there is a mention of Boris Johnson in your book, but there should be. Although the cartoon on the inside cover looks a little bit like him, I have to say, the little frog there. But anyway, Her Majesty will never forgive me. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute, and it is my great pleasure to be able to host this book launch today. You know that I have been accused of having a Luis Rubio fetish, and certainly I am an unabashed fan of Luis's work and of the man himself. In my time here in Washington in particular, I've learned an enormous amount from Luis. He has been an intellectual mentor to me in many ways, and he has helped the work of the Mexico Institute, not just by being a board member, but also by being a global fellow and an ongoing contributor to our work in the best way possible, which is that he provides us with his thoughts on what is happening in Mexico and what is a potential path forward. We're delighted that Ambassador Roberta Jacobson has been able to join us as well. Thank you, Roberta, for being with us, and thank you for agreeing to read the text in a short time. And she actually did it. I tested her before she came into the room. Sometimes we do that down at security downstairs. It's not just the wand that gets waved over you, ask you questions. And Carlos Bravo Regidor. I don't know if this is your first time here at the Wilson Center. Carlos and I have been talking for a while now, trying to work out the best time to bring him up here. And so I'm really, really glad that you could make it, Carlos. Congratulations for your sterling work in Mexico. Your op-eds are always worth reading, and for your academic work, of course, as well. So we hope that this is the beginning of a long and beautiful relationship with the Mexico Institute. For those of you who have followed our work for a long time, you know that Luis has published a number of books with us in the past. And the first 3 books that were published during my time here as director, Mexican Utopia, The Problem of Power, and A World of Opportunities, treated or dealt with Mexico and the question of, is it possible to move Mexico forward in the sense of applying the rule of law, solving some of the political problems, deep structural systemic problems in Mexico. And those books are replete with insights into Mexican politics. And I find it fascinating that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, as president, but previously as candidate, actually had a somewhat similar diagnosis to some of the things that Luis put in some of his previous books. Of what was wrong with Mexico. And certainly in terms of the way in which the political system was out of touch with the realities of Mexico. What Luis's new book does is it analyzes how Andrés Manuel came to power, what that teaches us about Mexico, and of course what we've learned from the first few months of the administration. Of course, this book was written a little while ago, so it's not completely up to date. And just to give you a heads up, Luis, my first question to you is, if you were to write this book today, what would you change? Because this is a constantly evolving situation in Mexico. But I want to thank you for writing the book, for agreeing to publish it with us. As I say, we're always open to your work, and we're deeply, deeply grateful for everything that you do for the Mexico Institute. So without any further blathering on from me, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Luis, who will present the major ideas of the book, and then we will get commentary from Ambassador Jacobson and Carlos.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Duncan, for your kind words, and thank you for your unstinting willingness to publish my blabbering. I'd like to make 7 points that try to summarize the argument and put today's Mexico in the context as I see it, and respond to the question that Duncan raised. First, López Obrador won for a number of reasons that have less to do with his agenda than it would appear, even if the key issues of the agenda like poverty, inequality, slow growth, and so on, are clearly the central problems of Mexico today. In fact, the way he's working towards the advancing his agenda is not likely to lead to successfully addressing those issues. And I think that's the big issue that we should be looking into for the future. He won largely because the benefits that were promised by the reforms of the past 30 years did not accrue generally or to everybody or fast enough. If you look at the voting patterns of the last, after the election, abstention rates were things that, the abstention rates were higher where things had improved greatly, ironically. And they were, the highest turnout was where things had not improved as much. So if you look at Oaxaca, Chiapas, the turnout was much higher than in Querétaro and Aguascalientes, the two states that have been growing fastest in the last several decades. Second point is that at heart the issue is demographic and generational. Mexicans older than 45 or so, who lived through the crisis, the financial crisis of the 70s through the 90s, saw the following 2 decades a significant improvement because there was peace, there was more or less stability, there was the economy was growing, and depends on where one lived, things were either much better or at least not worse. But the millennials had heard the promises all along and saw the reality, and they saw that those two didn't match. And they realized that more of the same, simply pursuing and continuing the road of the pattern of reforms of the past several decades, would not lead to the promised nirvana. I think that's where the fault line ultimately comes down to explaining the election. In a way, the way I began to see it, and when I started thinking about this election, was simply remembering how my parents talked about the Second World War. For them, it was vivid, and they had gone through it, whereas for me, it was only history. My children did not live through the crisis. They had already, they were already born, but they were not adults to realize what it was happening. For them, the following decades were natural. For them, it was, a nephew of mine once, when I was telling them how things had changed over previous decades and how there was scarcity at some point, how the crisis, continuous crisis, provoked lack of imports of A or B or C things, and there was no toothpaste at some point, and so on. And one of my nephews once asked, "So why didn't you go to Costco?" So aside from the controversies regarding President Peña's management of the election, the way he nominated his candidate, second, the way he thwarted his candidate, and third, above all, the way he prosecuted politically driven prosecution of Ricardo Anaya from PAN. Aside from that, the fact is that those two candidates ultimately were proposing what was no longer acceptable to the millennials, who already made a significant chunk of the population and were more or less the 23% of the electorate that gave López Obrador such a huge victory. 23% plus the 30 that he had secured over the previous 10 or 12 years. López Obrador diligently used Peña's spectacular corruption to create a narrative that won him the day. Third point is that the reasons for Mexico's underperformance are not very difficult to fathom. First and foremost, the reforms that were carried out, most of them were in the economic arena, were the right ones, but they were always skewed, if not thwarted, because the true objective was the preservation of the political order, of the status quo. And of course, the interests that derived from it. And those interests were not necessarily of one type or another. You can equally see some private monopolies, and you can see the bureaucracy, and you can see the CENTE, the coordinadora of the teachers, all of which have interest in preserving their own turf and the control of their specific areas. Even the two PAN administrations, Fox's and Calderon's, maintained that basic thrust. So this goes far deeper than simply a one type of administration. The special interests that have held parts of Mexico back were never confronted. Part of the explanation for what has happened in the South and why there's such a big difference between, such a big gap in performance between particularly the three southern states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas, and the rest, is that there are special interests that keep things as they are, and they don't that make it impossible for things to change. The CENTE, once again, is probably the easiest explanation for Oaxaca, but it's not the only one. There are many powerful interests everywhere that do that. And if you see the stark contrast in performance, just to mention again the two fastest growing states of Querétaro and Aguascalientes, they grow at Asian rates. Aguascalientes has been growing at more than 7% for more than 40 years. Whereas Oaxaca has barely stayed where it was 40 years ago. So the gap has become absolutely dramatic. It's not difficult to explain why there are so many more Oaxacans in Chicago or in LA than there are people from Aguascalientes. I guess there's not a single one, meaning migrant. The opposite, of course, is also true. Fourth point is that while the economic reforms were inherently coherent amongst themselves, the political ones were merely meant to appease one or another constituency or even individual. There were two reforms that were meant to appease López Obrador in particular, and he wasn't appeased. Hence the continued and persistent institutional weakness. Institutions are not the prime objective or are not seen by the political establishment as relevant. So the ease with which López Obrador has been both been able to centralize power and dismantled existing institutions is not surprising. Weak institutions have been assaulted by somebody who's inherently anti-institutional, and they have been both either neutralized or simply done away with. Fifth point, the real question, the real dilemma for López Obrador, in my view, is whether to pursue his obsessions, his agenda, much of it based on nostalgia, much of it based on the notion or the objective of recreating the 1960s, which was restated last week in full formal fashion in the Pemex operating plan that was published, or whether to turn his extraordinary legitimacy, charisma, skills, and support to undertake the reforms that Mexico really does need. And those are reforms that he is uniquely qualified to pursue, but he's, I think, inherently indisposed to do so. In one word, he's the kind of leader that I think Mexico could really benefit from at this juncture, but he's also hell-bent on pursuing an agenda that, in my view, is not only not the right one, but it's even a dangerous one. Sixth point is there's a risk and there's an opportunity here. This is the second time in recent times that Mexico's facing an enormous opportunity to transform itself. The first one was with Fox in 2000. He lost it because he had neither the vision nor the skills to lead the transformation or the will. It's also odd that both Fox and so far López Obrador have turned that opportunity into a personal adventure. It was all about Fox, it's all about López Obrador. It's not about an institutional transformation, which is, in my view, what Mexico truly requires. The risk, therefore, is of further stagnation, if not worse. On the flip side, the opportunity is also immense. Will López Obrador squander it? I think that that's the real question, and that's what has transpired in the last several months. As Duncan said at the beginning, this is a very fluid process, but what's not fluid is the fact that there is a very clear vision of what he wants to accomplish. And second, he's been attempting to do so at every juncture. By the same token, he's beginning to face the difficulties of implementing something that is difficult, inherently difficult. There are plenty of constituencies that are losing out, and they are not being shy about it. On the other, by the same token, I see people losing benefits and what I think had become already given rights, and they are not saying absolutely anything, and that's astounding to me. It often comes to my mind the famous quip by Benjamin Franklin that we've given you this if you can keep it, and I don't think that Mexicans are still there to keep it and to defend it. So my final point is that the issue in Mexico is inclusion, but the reality is one of extortion. Mexico's past success in the 20th century was based largely on rapid social mobility. That made it possible to transform a largely rural nation at the beginning of the 20th century into close to a majority middle class one by the end of it. That has stalled because of an economy that is thwarted by endless extortion by the authorities, by unions, by monopolies, by bureaucracies, by criminals, which undermine society and the economy, education and development. And that's something that has not changed one iota. And this makes it impossible for productivity to grow, for the economy to grow, and for jobs to be better and better paid. These are, I believe, the fundamental challenges of Mexico. They are not different from those that López Obrador has identified. They demand strong leadership to be addressed. It is López Obrador's opportunity to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Before we move on to the comments, I'd just like to recognize a couple of our board members who are with us. Andrew Seeley, great to have you here. Thank you. Welcome back, as always. Ambassador Arturo Saracen, lovely to see you again. Thank you for being here. Also to point out Ricardo Zúñiga, one of our fellows here at the Wilson Center. And we're always happy to have a wealth of State Department expertise and NSC expertise here. It really does help to guide us in our work. Roberta, Ambassador Jacobson, you have recently been quite vocal in your criticism, or rather analysis, should we say, of the AMLO administration. And so I was delighted when you agreed to come and participate in this panel. And I know that we'd spoke beforehand, and you said that you very much enjoyed the book. How does your analysis coincide or maybe differ somewhat from Luis's?
Thank you, Duncan. And one of the things I should say is that one of the best parts about not being an ambassador anymore is getting your first name back, which actually isn't ambassador. So I've been a big fan, I don't know about a fetishist, but a big fan of Luis's, actually since before I called him a colleague and a friend. And one of the reasons is because there is, among those of us who work, live, study Mexico and the US, there is always conventional wisdom, which tends to be fairly superficial, occasionally accurate, but not particularly illuminating. And then there's Luis Rubio, who will often say the things that we've been thinking instinctively, but thankfully he's got them backed up by data and reason and very elegant argumentation. So I joked with him, but it wasn't entirely a joke, that as I read the book, I kept thinking to myself, oh, thank God, what I have been thinking is obviously true if Luis believes it, and it's backed up by data and elegant argumentation. You know, I think one of the things I found really interesting is there was a lot of, all of us know that the 2018 elections in Mexico were perhaps one of the most studied and rehashed and explained. And among the U.S. press, unfortunately, there was a whole lot of arguments that either Mexico elected their Donald Trump or that Mexico elected a reaction to Trump, which in my mind described way too much causality to Trump or what was going on in the U.S. There were myriad other reasons, which Luis explains extremely well, for why Mexicans would vote for AMLO, and particularly why that 23%, which were not in fact the base. But one of the things that Luis really does explain here, which for me was kind of the V8 moment when I went, oh yeah, that's why. In terms of that relationship or reaction between Trump and López Obrador, when you look at the two factors that were so essential for Mexico in the last decades, one of them being NAFTA, the other being migration, for a number of reasons, both were threatened or being potentially dismantled by a Trump presidency and by Trump himself. And so he took that conventional wisdom and dug into it in a way that I found very, very very useful, very productive, very, very accurate. But I also think, that for those of us who have argued dryly and often, not particularly effectively, that the issue is rule of law and institutions and certainty and equal access, this book is a godsend because it argues those things in ways that I think are very persuasive. And I think when you look at AMLO and the way he's governing, based on a diagnosis that I think was largely accurate about what Mexico's problems were, as decider-in-chief, you see policies that are unlikely to get you to rule of law, stronger institutions, greater certainty, and greater access. So, I find myself very much in agreement with a lot of what Luis is writing. And yet I also have said to you, Duncan, and to Luis at the beginning, that as cynical as sometimes we think Luis is in that intellectual way, nobody writes a book like this filled with policy recommendations for a leader if they are not at root an optimist. Because no matter how many times you tell us that he is unlikely to take those recommendations, which may be the case, the fact that you have a need and a desire to lay them out is, to me, sort of the ultimate mark of not only an optimist, but a patriot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Carlos, as I say, it's your first time here at the Wilson Center, so we're all waiting with bated breath to hear what you have to say. But before we move on to you, I'd like to give a shout out to members of the Wilson Center staff, in particular Angela Robertson, Chris Wilson, Deputy Director of the Mexican Institute, Kathy Butterfield, for their work on editing and designing this book. I think it came out beautifully. I just want to put a little sort of aside in here. Luis proposed an image for the, or he rather liked an image for the front cover, which terrified me, and I put the kibosh on it. But at some point, I think Luis will reprint this book, and he'll put his preferred image on the cover, and then you'll get to see how horrific it really was. It gives me nightmares. I'm not going to go into any details, but not this. I wake up screaming at night sometimes thinking about it. And I had this image in my head for a long time. It's one of my favorite things that you see in crafts markets in Mexico. And I've loved it since the '94 crisis, when people said, you have to understand that Mexico and Mexicans wear masks. And I was like, okay, well, lots of countries wear masks, and you have to sort of take off one mask. But this one shows how many layers there are in Mexico. And I think that's it. Just when, as a foreigner, you think you've understood what's happening in Mexico, there's actually another layer underneath. So it was either this or an onion. And I figured that this was actually more Mexican. But anyway, Carlos, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to come to the Wilson Center. Thank you for inviting me, Duncan. Thank you to Angela for making it possible. And thank you to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here with you. The first thing I would like to say about this book is that it really does an important job in putting AMLO's victory in a larger context, particularly in the larger historical national context of Mexico for the last 40, maybe 50 years. And I think this is quite a service, given the fact that nowadays, because of social media technologies, we tend to stay at a certain epidermical level in terms of explaining what's going on, and it's always what in Spanish we call coyunturas, which I never found a satisfactory translation in English, like immediate happenings, And this book really does, you can tell there's an effort here to go beyond the coyuntura and really try to look at structural forces and factors that, ended up in the López Obrador victory. And this goes back beyond even the Peña Nieto administration. This goes back to the pivotal decade of 1980 and the reform process that Mexico underwent since then. The structural economic changes, the political reforms, the transition to democracy. There's also, I think, a third argument regarding demographic change, which is something we don't usually talk about a lot in Mexico, but that in this election, I think you make quite a convincing argument that the demographic change is, having a political impact. So that's something I really enjoyed about this book. I mean, the possibility of thinking about López Obrador in larger, more structural terms. Another thing that I like is the fact that, I've been reading Luis Rubio for quite a while now. And I can tell that, as to him as to many others, López Obrador is still quite like an intellectual challenge. It's somebody who's really difficult to pinpoint, whose very, crucial characteristic is his ambiguity. He can be like a populist, but a pragmatic one. He clearly portrays himself, and a lot of people, take him as a man of the left. But at the same time, he's conservative in many of his beliefs, in many of his decisions. It's really a difficult political animal to understand. And what I like about your reckoning with López Obrador is that you actually take stock of this complexity, of this ambiguity, and actually incorporate it within the explanation of why he won. I mean, one of the manifestations of this ambiguity is the large tent coalition that he's built. It's quite a feat, given the fact that you can find very progressive, very leftist people within this coalition, but also very conservative, old communists, pro-business. It's really quite remarkable how diverse this coalition is. And it's quite a political success for him to actually have been able to put it together. And, well, I mean, we can see now signals in his cabinet that, the coalition is kind of shaky, but it's still, I think, important to understand the building of this coalition as an answer to the question why he won this time, in contrast with the two previous ones. It's clear to me that López Obrador never really accepted defeat, conceded defeat, but that he learned from it. The López Obrador of 2006 is very different from the López Obrador of 2018. And it is, part of the answer of why he won this time. Not only, of course, that, there was this thing called the Peña Nieto administration that really paved the way for him to win, but also the fact that he knew how to adjust. In terms of his political strategy, not necessarily his political ideas or his vision of the country. Actually, I think this is another instance of his ambiguity. In terms of his strategy and his discourse, his campaigning style, he clearly changed. But in terms of his vision of Mexico, it's been pretty much the same ever since. A former professor of mine, Dane Borges, used to say that, a clock that has stopped working is still right twice a day. And I think 2018 was exactly the moment, like that for López Obrador. But what's interesting, and I think there's still a lot to be thought and studied about this, is this was not only about López Obrador, but about the Mexican voters. And although it is clear that he has had, the sympathies of around 30% of Mexican voters and kept it since 2006, there was about 23% of the vote that now came to him. And one of the interesting things about what we've had so far of the López Obrador government is that on the one hand, if you look at electoral results in Mexico for the last 3 presidential elections, one of the most salient features is volatility. Mexicans have voted for 3 different parties in the 3 last electoral cycles. And if you look actually at most of the districts have switched. First from Calderón to Peña Nieto, from PAN to PRI, and then from Peña Nieto to López Obrador, Morena. I think there's an argument to be made there about how, number one, how impatient the Mexican electorate has grown, how critical, how it's always elections about change. But the candidates that win are the ones who are able to portray themselves as representatives of a sort of conservative change, or change with stability. It seems to me that one of the political characteristics of the demographic change you talk about is the fact that Mexicans, are becoming exasperated or impatient or angry at their politicians, at the political system, at their economy. But at the same time, they're very aware and very scared of the dangers of, very sudden or very radical change. I think that might be one of the keys, in the contrast between the López Obrador of 2006 and 2018. In 2006, he still sounded a bit radical, a bit, what we in Spanish would term rijoso. And in 2018, he sounded very conciliatory, very moderate. Of course, during the transition period after he won, he unmade a lot of the things that he had built during the campaign regarding this style, and, well, also in government. But I mean, there's something to be said about the limits of the national explanation, so to speak, because I think in many ways, and I totally agree with the diagnosis you just mentioned, that López Obrador is not exactly a Mexican Trump, nor a Mexican reaction to Trump. I've heard that many times. I'm always tempted to tell, because this comes particularly from American commentators. I'm always tempted to say, guys, we're not that into you this time, really. It's not about you, and I'm sorry. We like you, but it's not about you. But I think Luis does a great job here saying it's neither of those things, but we should still reflect upon the significance of Trump's victory to Mexico, particularly in terms of migration and in terms of trade. But as I said, I think there's a limit within the national, or even the binational explanation, because a lot of the things that we're witnessing with López Obrador, we're witnessing in many other places. This is part of a larger cultural backlash, part of a larger populist resurgence. There's this, many commentators have said, the return of the strong man. And actually, as worrying as López Obrador's style or government might be, if you compare him with other, members of this strongman wave, he's actually kind of a benevolent one. And I put that in quotes, of course. But there's still something to be said about the fact that López Obrador seems to be more moderate when you compare him with other members of this great, the strongman wave, such as Donald Trump, for instance. So, I mean, another question that I have for Luis is this: I mean, if you were, if we were to push you a bit to try to insert the López Obrador phenomenon within these larger international waves, how would you insert them, or what do you think are the main factors that have purchased in explaining the López Obrador phenomenon within that larger, more international context? And finally, not to run into this a lot, there's also something that I was very interested in, because I've been a reader of Luis Rubio for quite a while, and if forced to characterize him in terms of his thought or his relationship with the Mexican political and economic process in the last decades, I would say you have been sort of a critical champion of the reform process. I mean, you've never been quite a champion in being like, in the train just cheering. You've always looked at the at the shortcomings. But in this book, you say, the ideas were right, but the implementation was not enough, or the implementation was wrong, because there is this sort of governability dilemma where, reformers in Mexico can't go all the way because of the political cost, or because of the lack of vision, or because, the politics are just not right. I think there's something there. It reminds me a bit of Lula in Brazil. Lula had to compromise with forces that really represented the opposite of what his project was. It's not only about the project or even about the implementation of the project. It's about like the hard political realities of the country, of the powers that be, that there's a point where you just have to choose to try to come to an understanding with them, because facing them or combating them is too costly. It happened with Fox. At some point, we know that Fox had to choose between the transformation that he had promised, or the possibility of, having a stable government. Of course, with López Obrador, is very different, because, his coalition is larger. He has a lot more power than Fox ever did in terms of, the Congress, in terms of governors, in terms of many instances where Fox faced restrictions and López Obrador doesn't. But still, it seems that López Obrador, having amassed all this political capital and having this, historical opportunity to push forward in terms of the transformation, there's something that's keeping him, from doing it. I think, as you very convincingly argue, it's about his vision, about his leadership style, but I think there's also something about the country in general, like the way, like forces are of like conservative coalitions or pro-status quo coalitions that keep on, being a force to be reckoned with, up to the point where even people with transformative projects, as Fox was in 2000 and López Obrador now, end up, accommodating with. And the last thing I want to say about this book that I find very challenging intellectually to wrap my head around is what the cost of López Obrador's leadership is becoming for the Mexican people. I think Mexicans voted for López Obrador, in the way you say, because they were tired of simulating, of the simulation, of the make-believe of the reform process. Sometimes this reminds me of Fidel Velázquez, who used to say, I've been telling you this can't go on. I've been telling you for 50 years, this can't go on. I feel that with the reform process that started in the 1980s, we're sort of achieving that point. And López Obrador was, in a way, somebody who said, let's just do away with it. Let's tear off the mask and say, this hasn't worked. Luis Rubio has an argument saying, well, it has worked, for certain sectors, up to a certain extent. But yes, it hasn't worked for everybody. And its deficits have become unbearable for a significant portion of the population. So in that sense, I think that López Obrador has been able, because of his leadership style, he was able to win, and as you said, I fully agree with that, more because of what he represented than because of what he proposed. López Obrador has done something, I think, really significant and important to the Mexican political spectrum, where it has become a bit more Americanized, in the sense that nowadays it seems to be more about political identities than about political ideas. I think his victory was not exactly or not necessarily about his diagnosis of the country, but more about his capacity to appeal to certain affects of the Mexican population, to grievances, to anger, to indignation. And in that regard, what we're seeing today, and this is really something to consider, is that a significant portion of Mexicans are willing to go along with decisions that López Obrador makes, even if they don't agree with them. Number one, for instance, the cancellation of the airport. All polls but a couple show that most Mexicans did not agree with that. And nowadays, it seems that it's no longer an issue, even though the cost is, mind-blowing. Another one, migration. Mexico built a discourse around migration for decades, which was about countering, what was the American right discourse about immigrants. Immigrants were not criminals. Immigrants ended up contributing more than what they cost. Immigrants integrated within their communities. Immigration was good. And now in the last year, that discourse, that consular tradition, if you will, has really gone down the drain. And Mexico has adopted, in many ways, the Trumpist vision of immigration, which I think is quite a historical betrayal. And what really kills me is that I can understand why even if I don't agree with it, I can understand the political calculus López Obrador was forced to make because of Trump's threats. But what I really can't understand is how, the shift in public opinion that this represented. And, that there's a majority of public opinion now supporting the very measures we rejected when the measures were, against Mexicans, when Trump's message was, we're going to build a wall and Mexicans are going to pay for it. Mexicans were furious. But now that the message is, we're not going to build a wall, we're just going to have Mexico do that job, most Mexicans agree. And I think the reason why they agree is not necessarily because they have changed their minds in terms of what migration is, but because they're somehow supporting the Mexican president's decision to go along with Trump's threat. What kind of leadership are we dealing with here? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Let me take this opportunity to recognize our leader, Jane Harmon, CEO, President of the Wilson Center. Thank you for being here, Jane. I know that you're a personal friend of Luis's, and of course of Roberta's. I will give you back your first name. And I would like to allow Luis to respond to the comments from Roberta and Carlos. But I'd like to add in one thing of my own, if I may. And that is that you began, Luis, by talking about this disjuncture, that millennials had heard all the promises about neoliberalism, about reform, about modern Mexico, and then they compared it with reality and they saw that the two things didn't match up. To what extent are we seeing something similar unfold for Andrés Manuel? There have been all kinds of promises made, and he continues to make promises. But to what extent are we seeing that people are observing that those promises do not match the reality right now in Mexico? And I'll just point out to a conversation that took place in a seminar that we had here last week at the Mexico Institute, looking at the question of agricultural subsidies and conditional cash transfers in Mexico. And anecdotal, admittedly, but some of our field researchers had said that they were speaking to people who said, look, I used to get money under the Prospera program. And Andrés Manuel promised that his new program would be better than that we'd get more money. But the old money no longer comes, and the new money hasn't started arriving yet. And I still support the president, but I'd really like to have the money. At what point does that disjuncture between promise and reality come back to bite the president? And sort of building on that, the issue of apathy amongst Mexican voters, I think, has been a very important one for many years. And there's a line from an old song which I love, which is apathy is happy that it won without a fight. And I think that describes what's happened in many, many countries around the world. And yet, at the same token, you see that in the election last year, Mexicans were motivated to go out and vote for a candidate that they thought would bring change. And as Carlos himself just said, that change has been a theme of many recent elections in Mexico. And I was asked recently to comment on Mexican democracy. Where's it going? And I said, well, ultimately, you have to point at 2018 to say that democracy delivered what many Mexicans believed it would never deliver, which was an anti-establishment candidate. So I'd love to hear the reactions from Luis, but also from Roberta and Carlos to those comments. Luis.
Thank you, Roberta, Carlos, and Duncan. Let me try to address all of these issues quickly. First, Mexico had a very easy way for many years and made it possible to carry out the reforms at a fairly low cost because of NAFTA and migration. NAFTA provided the certainty for investors, both local and foreign. And in fact, there are many Mexican companies that invest in Mexico as foreign companies to enjoy the benefits of NAFTA. And migration made it possible not to address the issues of productivity, the informal economy, and so on, that were piling up because there was a labor market, a bigger labor market that was absorbing the surplus labor that Mexico was producing. So the combination proved very easy for a bureaucracy and an establishment that was benefiting from it all. And not surprisingly, the states that are the largest exporters of people are also, or mostly the same, that are less willing to reform themselves. So it's an obvious match, and that's Oaxaca, Zacatecas, Michoacán, Guanajuato. Second point, I truly agree. I don't think that López Obrador is a reaction to Trump. I think it helped. He was helped in the margin by that, simply because Mexicans were very upset that nobody in the Mexican political arena was responding to Trump's insults as Mexicans saw them. And López Obrador, by saying I'm going to have him respect us, sort of played sat on the wall very uneasily but very effectively by saying they will respect us and we won't have to do anything else. Yet, as Carlos mentioned, the international arena helped him simply because there is such a wide criticism of the globalization that has taken place in the past several decades throughout the world. He's not an exception in the world anymore, even though I doubt that there was so much change. But he does feel unconstrained in doing things that 10 years ago would have been impossible. And that's much more true because of the fact that that NAFTA has been put in doubt. In fact, if anything is absolutely certain, is that NAFTA was conceived of in order for somebody like, if in case somebody like López Obrador came to government. At that moment it was Cárdenas, but that was the issue. Nobody in Mexico or in the U.S. ever thought that the questioning NAFTA would come from the U.S. So from the Mexican perspective, the 99% of the value of NAFTA is not the rules and regulations and schedules and tariffs and so on. It is Chapter 11, which is what provides certainty for investors. That's what Mexico was looking at, and that's what General Scowcroft in particular understood and pushed for. So the world arena is very important, except for the U.S. López Obrador has been accepting, he very much in the 1960s mindset, he sees the U.S. as a threat, not as an opportunity. He's been accepting the fact that he has to subordinate himself to Trump's priorities, and he's been doing so willingly. And Carlos, I couldn't say it as elegantly as he did. This goes counter to his base, goes counter to his own arguments and to Mexico's in general, and yet he's been playing that role very, very effectively. I fully agree that in the process of negotiating and implementing whatever policies, there are natural political hindrances and limits. That's natural in any sense. What I believe is that the problem lies somewhere else. I don't think that the issue is so much implementation, because again, you implement what's possible. Where I think Mexico is very different from other reforming countries, from Korea to Spain to Colombia to Chile, wherever, is that there is an integral vision in those countries and everything fits there. So whenever something doesn't work, it's looked at and attempted to be addressed in the context of how do we fix it and how do we move on. In Mexico, this has been there has been a radical difference between liberalization in some sectors and in others. There has been even though democracy has delivered some things, it has not been an institutional process or as strong as an institutional process as it has been in the economy. Interestingly enough, López Obrador does have a very integral vision of the future. He has a whole vision. He wants to implement everything together. He's, in that sense, if he were to reform, he will understand that which things don't fit with the general vision. So I remember a couple of anecdotes. Felipe González, when oil prices went very high, he was as president, he said, well, we've all become impoverished. In Mexico, the response that Peña made and López Obrador has given in the last few months is let's subsidize the price of gasoline, period. So the difference is we don't accept that the establishment doesn't accept that there is a need to reform everything. Just those things that make us maintain and keep the ship moving, in particular exports. And that's the reason why López Obrador feels constrained. That's the only real constraint that he feels, because exports are the only real or the strongest engine of growth of Mexican economy. About Duncan, about the gap in promises and delivery. First of all, it's too early. Even though he's de facto been a year in office, formally he's only been 7 months. And more important, I think that his hardcore of supporters, which surely is at least 30%, but probably more, will give him as long or as much leeway as he needs to wait. But you are absolutely right that the apathy of the citizenry and the disconnect between delivery and promises at some point raises more fundamental questions. You told me yesterday that because everything's free, then nobody expects anything else. But people who already have acquired rights have come to expect that, and I cannot imagine that they will not eventually come to raise hell. I think that the real issue is not whether there's a future for democracy. I think it will continue. I think the issue is whether it's going to be more of a liberal democracy. I think it's that where the question lies for the future.
Thank you. Roberta.
So I'd like to address a couple of things. I'm going to get to some of the things that Luis and Duncan said, but I want to take up one of the issues that Carlos mentioned, because maybe I am, in fact, ultimately cynical about this, but the changing view of Mexicans to migration, to Central American migration in particular, but from other places as well, I cannot help but go back to a sort of saying that may be superficial, but where you stand depends on where you sit. Mexico is, it boils down to geography. And I do think, in fact, in some respects, those organizers of caravans did nobody any favor with the Mexican population, because what happened was, despite the fact that caravans are a very small percentage of the total number of migrants, they concentrated the issue both as a policy matter and as a practical matter on the ground. And so all of a sudden, you had a situation in which this was not about the U.S. versus Mexico and how you're treating our connationals. This was about, do we want to be flooded with more Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and Hondurans? Do we want the government offering jobs in places like Oaxaca and Chiapas, which have struggled to provide its own citizens jobs, et cetera? And so I think ultimately their changing view of migration is due to a significant change in Mexico's own physical as well as policy position. from a sending country to not just a transit, but ultimately a receiving country, especially if the discussions with the United States continue in this manner with people staying in Mexico. But I also think that Mexicans who believe that are willing to give López Obrador a pass because of his ratings on so many other issues, right? You are willing to accept that despite saying very firmly he would stand up for Mexico and Mexico will be respected, when the reality does not comport, that works at somewhere between 60 and 85% approval ratings. It clearly did not for Peña Nieto when he was below 30%, et cetera. One of the things I think is interesting is I do remember a conversation with López Obrador, and it was one of my earlier conversations with him, in which he said, you know, what people don't always understand is Mexicans could never elect Donald Trump. And he paused, as he does so often, and I chose not to jump into that silence because I was curious as to what aspect of that he meant. And what he said was, we could never elect someone who wasn't a career politician. And that was very interesting because, of course, he did run as an outsider, but he is a career politician. And so it is this very, I think, interesting balancing act he has to do between insisting that he can get things done, that he can, in fact, as you said, be the result of the unthinkable, an anti-establishment victory by a career politician who has changed parties only so far as he wants them to continue to be reflections of himself. And when they aren't, he leaves. But the other thing I think that's really interesting about this promise and reality, which Duncan raised, is I'm so struck by your comment, Duncan, on the ag subsidies and the way those in the agricultural sector may feel. In other words, things that, the old program has stopped, but we haven't yet gotten the new program. We still support the president, but we'd really like the money. Go talk to American farmers.
Yeah.
The trade battles are killing us. Do you still support President Trump? Absolutely, because he's standing up for us. Now, that is wearing thin in some sectors of agriculture in the United States, but not nearly as quickly or as broadly as you might expect by people whose oxes are, in fact, being gored. And so when we talk about the base, right, at that base being slightly over 30%, something like that, it's pretty similar to what you see, unmovable in many respects by facts or even economic, disadvantageous economic policies. And then finally, I would say, one of the things that I've been focused on is the way in which López Obrador, exactly consistent with what he has always said, has paid no attention to foreign policy except where it concerns North America and in particular the U.S. The most recent kerfuffle over not attending the G20 is an example of that, but it is, so when we talk about AMLO in a larger context, I think he is very much a part of a broader context of citizenry being disappointed in the delivery of their democracies, and yet in some ways he disdains or refuses to be present at events that might highlight that similarity or difference among leaders, because his focus is on Mexico as unique, as separate, as disattached and disarticulated from that international system. And in part, that's why when you argue a backward-looking policy as he is, that backward-looking policy is also a return to a Mexico that is not integrated into an international system. So it is very much consistent. He talks about getting our own house in order being the best foreign policy, but in fact, he doesn't necessarily want to keep drawing those integrationist and involved comparisons with other leaders, and the absence of his participation in those conferences is part of that.
Well, in fact, the turnaround that Mexico experienced in the 1980s was the result of a recognition that Mexico could not fix its own problems and needed the U.S. And that was because
That really is all about us, right?
no, but after 100 years of seeing the U.S. as the enemy, for Mexico it was an enormous change in direction, and that's one that people like López Obrador disputes.
And it's also, I mean, the other thing that I think is fascinating that we haven't talked about is the perception of Mexicans about the United States, right? Post-NAFTA, but even post-'80s, right? You have 30 plus years of slowly and painfully, with significant success, reducing that sort of genetic anti-Americanism and historic anti-Americanism in Mexico to a point where younger Mexicans don't really feel that instinctively or understand why mom and dad might, or grandma and grandpa. That's gone, right? That was wiped out in a year from a 60+% approval rating, not just of the US government under a particular administration, but of the United States. What you saw initially was a plummeting in the way a US administration was viewed, and a distinction between that and the way the United States was viewed, and subsequently you saw that crater too, more than 30 percentage points. And you can't win that back overnight.
But that's a lot of Trump, more than López Obrador.
It is, exactly. I think that's right. But I think that that needs to be of concern to López Obrador, because if your policy is to prioritize the relationship with the United States almost at all costs, and your polity has abandoned, in some respects, that admiration for the country, not necessarily just the government, that can become more unsustainable more quickly.
Carlos, would you let me take a couple of questions from the audience, and then I'll give you the first right to respond. So there's Leela Abed down here. If you can get a microphone quickly. Arturo, you've been nodding and smiling. I think there's a question coming. No?
Hi, good morning. It's very interesting. I have a deeper question about how you mentioned, and you started off, Luis, talking about weak institutions. I think Mexico also has weak political parties. And as we see right now, we don't really have opposition parties that, can really kind of garner enough support both within their own structures as with the voters in general. And we started off in Mexico with a one-party system for more than 70 years. We started in this democratic experiment in the elections with Fox. And now we see an opposition that's completely fragmented, and that there's new political parties coming to life, right? As Calderon's new political party, for example. And we're kind of reverting back to a one-party system with Morena, which only exists really because of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And I think that, leaders that are based on on their charisma and their charismatic leaders, they tend to be the weakest of leaders. And so my vision is just, as a democratic political system, what are the solution to Mexico's elections in the future if we only have a Morena who's really kind of utilizing the same mechanisms that the PRI used in its 70-year decade rule with the super delegates? Now they're above the governors to a certain extent. You have a majority, a simple majority in the Senate, but a majority in the Congress. And so you really kind of see that although we're in a democratic system, we're back to authoritarianism masked as a democracy, right? Because at the end of the day, the president can really kind of rule in a majority way. And so I think that to a certain extent, that's kind of anti-democratic. And so I'm from Mexico, I worked in Mexican politics, and it hurts to see, Mexico kind of going back to what we were in the past. So I don't know what your view is on that.
Thank you. And Leela, your affiliation?
I work at Covington and Burling.
Thank you. Question, Rafael. The microphone's coming, Rafael.
Rafael Bernal with the Hill newspaper. I'll make a more superficial question as expected of political journalists. From the campaign operative tactical standpoint, this is something I still don't fully understand. With Vicente Fox, you had Cambio y Amigos de Fox on the tactical standpoint. Calderon used a lot of party structures to support, not this guy, essentially, argument. Peña Nieto, you had the cards. what is, at the tactical level, how did Morena pull off taking the message of change and anti-corruption and so on down to the structures and actually getting the voters out and la operación política at the very ground level?
Interesting. And a third question, if there is one? A rather reticent audience. Andrew.
Thanks. Andrew Redman with Monarch Global Strategies. Maybe a question sort of looking forward a little bit. I think you can sort of, everybody agrees in the panel and elsewhere that AMLO's diagnosis of what are the challenges facing Mexico is pretty accurate, and yet so far a lot of the policies he's implementing seem to be almost the worst possible way to resolve any particular challenge. And I wonder, given his approach and personality, his own self-confidence, do you think at some point he changes direction and sort of recognizes that he's going the wrong way, or is this going to be 5.5 more years of just, sort of, if you will, mistake after mistake with the right intentions but the wrong execution?
I'm really glad you asked that question. It's the question that I get asked the most. Is like, so when does he sort of begin to change? And when that happens, which way does he go? So anyway, Carlos, I said I would give you the first right of replica.
Okay, well, so a couple of things. First, regarding the operación política question. As I mentioned, I think one of the key features of the Mexican public electoral behavior has been volatility. And I think that in many ways, if you look at the incredibly ambitious social programs that the López Obrador government is putting in place, there's an interpretation to be made in which the main aim of those programs is actually to mitigate electoral volatility. A lot of pro-López Obrador people would say we have a new hegemony. We're hegemonic now. I don't think that's the case. I think they're trying to build that hegemony, and that the key to building that hegemony is actually mitigating electoral volatility. Because as I said, Mexican voters have grown incredibly impatient. Every presidential election since 2000 has been one way or another about change. So if the López Obrador project, survives the López Obrador presidency, which is a big if because of what you said about, Morena being more a political movement built around López Obrador's leadership than an actual political, institutionalized political party, I think it comes down to that. If they're able to, build a structure that mitigates that electoral volatility. Now, regarding another question, I couldn't help but remember an event we had with Andrés Martinez, who's in the room, in ASU in Mexico City about a month ago, in which Mary Beth Sheridan, a former and now again correspondent of Washington Post in Mexico, she had been in Mexico during the 1990s, and now she's back. And one of the things that strike her the most, and I think this is one of those great observations that, people who live in Mexico somehow, we miss it because we're in the everyday, stuff. And she said, "What the hell happened with Mexican nationalism?" I think that's a great question. I have my hypothesis on that. One might be, well, integration with the U.S. has become so big and so everyday that actually to mobilize Mexican nationalism against the U.S. doesn't, carry water as it used to before. Maybe there's been a cultural change because, we're so integrated and Mexicans work for American companies or, export to the US. So it's not only, it doesn't carry water, but nobody wants to do it anyway. But maybe a third answer is, the only politician with enough credibility to mobilize Mexican nationalism against Donald Trump is the one in power and is the one who would not do it, for the reasons that have been talked about here. Regarding your question about the disjuncture between promise and reality and when will it come back to bite the president, I agree with Luis. I think it's too early. I think his supporters will give him a lot of leeway. But I think there's one more thing, which is the problem of political opposition. Opposition is in shambles. And even if you become disenchanted with López Obrador, these days or in a year in Mexico, you have nowhere to go. So I think that's gonna carry him, through his term, with higher approval ratings than if the opposition was in better shape. Now, regarding the question of the, him being anti-establishment, I think, and I fully agree with Roberta here, I think AMLO is the ultimate outsider from within, right? And out of the three main characteristics, or the three, may put it in a dramatic way, the main horse riders of the current populist apocalypse, anti-immigration, anti-globalization, and anti-establishment, I think López Obrador won because of the third. His message was not necessarily anti-immigration, of course. It was not anti-globalization. He's critical, but there are certain readings of it that say, you know who saved the renegotiation of NAFTA? López Obrador did. So he's not necessarily, he understands how important integration with the export sector is, and what a blow it would have been, to not have a new sort of commercial agreement with the US. So I think out of the three, anti-establishment is really where the money is, but again, up to a certain extent. He's not fully anti-establishment, maybe yet. And finally, because of a number of the other questions, I understand why people tend to think that López Obrador and Morena represent a certain nostalgia for the golden epoch of the PRI, and there's an impulse to go back. But I think there's something different that we need to consider, and that makes a hell of a difference, which is democratic legitimacy. Morena is not the old PRI, because Morena came to power with a lot of democratic support. And even though there might be these nostalgic impulses or these, you can even call them reactionary dreams, the fact that Morena has the democratic support that it has renders it different. The old political system cannot be rebuilt when you introduce the importance of democratic support. Thank you.
Thank you. Luis.
Carlos said something at the beginning in his previous intervention that is very, very important. He said that even though López Obrador has never conceded defeat, he learned from it. But the not conceded is very important, because he still has not conceded that it was the process that let him win this election. He and his entourage believe that they were finally recognized, that they were given power, that they took over. In a way, they don't see this as different from having taken power in a coup. They see themselves as legitimately, as being legitimized in having arrived at power, but not constrained by the rules of the game. In that regard, it's a very different government. It's a very different system that starts from not recognizing that the electoral reforms that made it possible for the PRI to lose or for somebody else to win beginning in 2000 are very very relevant. I'll just add a couple of things to the things that Carlos already said on the questions. First, on the political parties, you're absolutely right. I'll simply add two things. One is that the oddity of Morena is that it cannot be institutionalized because the leader is institutional, and in that he himself is limiting the possibility of long-term transcendence. Even though I do agree that its behavior is PRI-like, and you wouldn't expect any other, because López Obrador comes from, he's the hardcore from the hardcore of the PRI, of the hardcore era of PRI. The PRI itself today is facing whether the dilemma of whether to join Morena or try to rebuild itself, and that's coming in the election for the presidency in October, I believe, September or October. PAN is the only of the traditional parties that remains more or less as a party with very weak leadership and with very little sense of direction, but at least has numbers that could help them rebuild something. I don't see much possibility in Calderón's party. He has advanced very slowly. He himself does not have a big strategy, and the only candidate he could put together is not a great candidate. She's a great person, but not a great candidate. And I wouldn't be surprised if she eventually rejoined PAN. Some politicians believe that the real opposition, in the sense of the real electoral opposition, will eventually come from a total outsider of the political system or of traditional politics. Who knows if that's possible? Roberta's comment is really interesting in that regard. More important, I think, is that the big legislative battles will take place in the Senate, which is the only place in which the combined opposition has a majority, and that won't change in the 6 years because the Senate is permanent for 6 years, and the pre-contingent there is not close to the governors who would be the ones that would join Morena, so de facto join, not legally. On your question, Andrew, what happens if when he hits a wall? As most politicians in the world do at some point. I don't think he'll change. I mean, ultimately, this is a call for him to take a different direction, a direction that would be much more suitable to attaining his own objectives. I think he's too committed to his own vision. I think he would feel that he would be betraying himself, and for him, that's enormously important. When he was mayor of Mexico City, I held hundreds of conversations with him, and he has that very, very strong sense that his commitment to that vision is what he's worth, and that's where he comes from, and that's where he wants to get to, and that's why he placed himself from the very beginning already at the level of the biggest figures of Mexican history. He's not expecting history to recognize him. He's already placed himself there.
But that raises, I think that raises a really important question, which is, he made a gamble that putting himself on the ballot in the midterms, right, was going to be good for him in terms of avoiding full lame duck status, perhaps, and also good for his party. That may still be true, but I don't know if it's as certain that 2 years hence, everybody, feels the same about him and therefore votes down the ballot as he had hoped at the beginning. I do think one of the quotes that Luis uses is absolutely crucial to answering Andrew's question, which is, I always think the same but act according to circumstances. Right? So I think we get back to what Carlos said, which is his chief characteristic is ambiguity. And I don't think we know whether he'll change or in which direction that might be.
And even if he changes, he's not going to sell his change as change, but as congruence.
Right. Well, we've seen that be fairly successfully done by other politicians.
Luis, any final words?
Thank you.
I would like to thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much for your insights, your comments. Luis, we look forward to the next book. I assume you've written one in the time it took us to discuss this one. It's annoying that somebody can write a book quicker than I can read it. But anyway, thank you very much for everything. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I look forward to our next conversation here at the Mexico Institute.